Hello, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to talk about realpolitik or political pragmatism.
Wait, are you sure
Um,
we're on? Oh, here we go.
yeah, we're going to talk about political pragmatism, and these are my two partners in crime, my 2 cents and pragmatic culture.
Hey, this is my 2 cents. I'm a YouTuber who basically gives my 2 cents about a whole range of things, in economics a lot, but a bunch of other stuff.
Hi, I'm just here because I was promised. Voltaire promised me shekels, so I'm just here for the shekels. No, I'm. I also try to make videos and stuff, and I try to be pragmatic about things. Ooh, it's in my name.
Indeed.
So, our main topic of today is realpolitik and what's the consequences of reploying this philosophy in as the world. We're probably going to talk about the First World War and Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, and also probably going to talk about Nixon and Henry Kissinger and what their effects were. So, we probably need to define realpolitik as well. Realpolitik is a political philosophy developed by Machiavelli back in the 16th century, basically saying that morality the main definition is of realpolitik is that we need to do what is pragmatic in situations with no ideological or moral principles, basically. Hopefully I didn't strawman that definition of real political practice. Is that
Okay.
fair?
Well, I'd say using Machiavelli, it definitely is. I think the quote from the Prince that has made Machiavelli most famous is "The ends justify the means." So, in Machiavelli's view, there really were no ethical considerations. There was the outcome was the only thing that was important. And perhaps, like one of the examples he gives in his book, The Prince, was he encouraged leaders of countries to actually cause problems and then fix them, so that when if the people were unaware of the fact that the prince himself had caused the problem, they would be grateful for him for fixing the problem. And nonetheless, even though he was both the source and the solution, it was pragmatic in Machiavelli's view because the people would be more loyal to him.
Yeah, I wouldn't. Realpolitik, from a historical context, had less to do with Machiavelli, although it was influenced with him, and more to do with what Bismarck kind of instilled, because it was more of a German conception in that it was used to justify the unification of the various German principalities into the one German state so that they could actually achieve some amount of political power. And it wasn't necessarily that it was a lack of moral consideration, but almost so that what was, if you're focusing on the outcomes of your political if you're focusing on the outcomes of what your politics can do, it's more about whether or not those outcomes are good or not, as opposed to whether or not your intentions behind them are actually good.
That's interesting. That's what I can understand what realpolitik is. I know a couple pragmatists. They say they don't base their stuff on ideological principles or morality. They seem like they based on it on empirical data and what's going on around them, and this is the best trade off as they can get. That's what I can get from these political pragmatists and people who support realpolitik.
I would agree, and perhaps like a personal example I would give would be, so everybody can see on my avatar there, I have the anarcho-capitalist flag in the background, and in as much as philosophically speaking, I do like the idea of anarcho-capitalism. However, my pragmatic side tells me that anarcho-capitalism is not likely to happen anytime soon, especially given the current political climate we have. So despite the fact that you might say that's my underlying philosophy, I'm also a pragmatist in that I'm not aggressively campaigning for the creation of Ancapistan because I know that's not going to happen without some other major steps first.
Also, this is that's the other interesting point. I'm remembering a debate with a presidential debate with when Ron Paul was expounding his common rhetoric, supporting a non-interventionist policy, where John McCain accused him of being a isolationist. Also, ironically, I got this book, Diplomacy, basically saying that Henry Kissinger basically say that America was pretty isolationist when it comes to world affairs, specifically European affairs as well.
It's it's kind of interesting, like to think about realpolitik as such a broad, overarching term kind of leads to a few misconceptions of it because there's a lot of things that can be justified under the umbrella of realpolitik and pragmatism because at the same time those things both have different interpretations depending on who you talk to. For example, someone who might be into realpolitik in terms from like a leftist viewpoint might describe that or might say that it'd be easier to just pass a one payer or single payer healthcare system in the United States now because it's kind of like, well, the problem of healthcare was created by the government in the first place. So if we solve it, we look good. But at the same time, they're ignoring the problems that would create. Whereas if we kind of tried to solve it using the more free market approach now, it wouldn't exactly be working. You know, it'll take a while to be effective, and there will be some negative consequences. But it's kind of the more idealist approach. So it's viewed from that certain angle. So it's there's the subjective lens to everything
Oh,
that has
absolutely.
to be taken into account.
And I
Yeah,
think you raised a
also
valid
with
point that realpolitik could be applied by people on the right or the left depending on what their particular political goals are. So
it also make the politician whoever implemented, let's say Medicare for all scheme to be really looking really good. That claim he solves the problems of a pro- problems of free market healthcare as well.
Uh, I think we have a guest?
Yeah, I'm one of Zach's friends.
Oh,
I
okay,
okay,
just got
cool.
the link.
just want to
Nice to.
introduce yourself quick.
Yeah, I'm Chris. Um, I don't really have any way to identify myself quite yet, so I can't really say I'm libertarian or anarcho-capitalist or anything like that.
Is Zach coming?
Yeah, you should be coming any second. We were just talking, and one other guy should be coming as well.
Okay, this is going well.
Excellent.
Uh, what's your thoughts on real political political pragmatism?
Um, you're talking to me, right?
Yeah.
I think your base should be moralistic. You should follow your morals first, and when you come to a situation where you're conflicted because your morals might not lead to a good outcome, then pragmatism, the practical outcome, might take over your morals.
Interesting. And so, speaking in terms of current U.S. politics, you'd say what would be an example of this, at least in your mind?
I think the take a knee thing. Um, so, for my morals, the baseline that I follow is I believe in free speech. So I believe people should be able to practice this without repercussions, which is the take a knee. I mean, whatever the reason they're doing the take a knee, Black Lives Matter or whatever, it's basically protest. And I think they should be able to do it without repercussions. But if it causes this uproar, like civility or uncivility, I mean, basically riots, which it's not right now, then it's got to be stopped. It's not. It hasn't gone that far yet. But I'm as an example.
So, like, if it were to cause riots, you would say it's time to kind of quell this thing?
Basically.
So I think it'd be kind of like, I guess you're saying with your free speech, you're more about government being out of free speech, but then at some point the state should be allotted some amount of power to kind of be a little forceful.
Yeah, people should be free in the beginning, but when things get out of hand, the government is necessary. The government is practical, basically.
Interesting.
Okay. Playing devil's advocate, then, what do you believe? What checks should exist against the government, if any? I mean, can the government go too far? Because that would seem to be the biggest problem in my mind.
Oh, yeah, the government will go too far. It's always come to that, no matter what. But then again, if the government isn't there at all, the people will go too far. You just have to strike the right balance between freedom and control, basically.
I think that's one of the goal of Realpolitik, actually, to try to strike that balance.
Yeah, either extreme, anarchism and communism, they're both bad, obviously. So the real question is, where in the middle is the best mix? Hi, Chandler.
Hi. Um, oh man, that worked.
Sorry.
It took me forever because I don't know technology.
Fair
Other
enough. Takes a little while to figure out.
Another technological pleb with us.
Hell yeah.
Don't be rude, Voltaire.
Well, I'm technological pleb as well.
What the fuck?
So, did the two guys who joined after Chris just like want to give us your intro and just a little bit about what you think about Realpolitik?
Sure, Chandler, you can go ahead and say what you want to say.
All right. My name is Chandler Fairfield. I'm a libertarian. I believe, in a sense, that while we should pay attention to culture and other soft politic things because they do eventually bleed into real politics. I do think it's very important. It's very important to focus on policy because that in the now is affecting us. And to get hung up entirely in culture or entirely in morals is just stupid.
Yeah, I see your point there.
Intellectual, you want to say anything or?
I'm a little bit similar to Chris in some respects. I kind of feel as if morals and pragmatism can go a little bit hand in hand. But because again, I'm a libertarian, almost ANCAP. My only real reserves are just I feel like the government can be, in a sense, kind of a pragmatic tool. How it can be a little bit more efficient in certain areas, such as like not entirely like monetarily efficient, but I mean like having one military for the state or having small safety nets. I think could be very beneficial. How it could be a little bit more efficient.
So you're like a Nozick minarchist?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, minarchist,
okay.
Essentially. But my main thing is that I think most people are just driven by self-interest, so that, psychological egoism. So I feel, most times when you're making decisions, it's just out of self-interest.
No, can't argue with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's there's also I think in the long run when it comes to politics and I think it also causes a lot of problems that unnecessary death in the world because of that due to that mindset of thinking.
Yeah, and I almost forgot. My main thing about it, pragmatism versus morals, I think it's just ingrained in a social contract within a society. Because I know, like in the United States today, we're basically ingrained in a society that values morals higher than pragmatism. So you look at something like jailing. So you have inmates that are in there for life, and I feel like a more pragmatic approach would just be, killing those inmates so they don't siphon resources. But since we have certain morals, we keep them alive.
Oh, even as a libertarian.
Damn.
Even as a libertarian, I still support the death penalty.
Gotcha.
I mean, I imagine it'd be very context sensitive because, like, there are some cases like, Bernie Madoff, I don't honestly think should have gone away for life because he didn't kill anyone. Yeah, he ruined lives, but he didn't take lives. He didn't destroy property. He stole it. He's a thief on a massive scale. But I think putting him in jail for life is a waste. And by extension, I think executing him would be unwarranted. Granted, I don't think that's the case for everybody. Like maybe there's probably murderers and stuff who could, who we could do without. But I don't. In the case of people like Madoff and other some white collar type criminals, I'm not sure I'd support that.
Well,
Like,
the problem that like some people actually argue that the life me personally, I'm not necessarily a big fan of the death penalty, but I understand that there are certain cases where it's just simply easier and more pragmatic, more reasonable to do it. However, I think that there are certain, a lot of people make the argument that sometimes being in there for life is worse than death, in some senses, because, it's over with quickly, and people who do especially heinous crimes, sometimes you want them to suffer a little while in there.
I don't know.
It sounds a little fucked up in that sense.
That ironically sounds way more humane. I'd rather just take the death penalty.
Exactly.
Real quick, do we want to kind of give a definition of pragmatism that we all kind of agree on, so we have a little bit of common ground, I guess?
Well, I actually pulled
practice,
up I pulled up a definition for Realpolitik on what's it? I got the Encyclopedia Britannica academic version here, so I can read off the definition for Realpolitik if you want.
Gotcha.
Right, yeah.
Sounds good.
Okay, so Realpolitik is politics based on practical objectives rather than on ideals. The word does not mean real in the English sense, but rather connotes things, hence a politics of adaptation to things as they are. Realpolitik thus suggests a pragmatic, no-nonsense view and a disregard for ethical considerations. In diplomacy, it is often associated with relentless, though realistic pursuit of the national interest. So it does kind of imply, I guess, a lack of ethical underpinnings. Although, I think whoever said it before, I don't think the two are necessarily
They're not
opposed to one another. Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive.
I feel like they kind of take over within certain situations. I think that's
way I've heard it. It seems like pragmatism is just getting the best trade-off possible.
Yeah.
That's-
Here's a question. Was Nazi Germany a good example of realpolitik?
Nah.
It makes you wonder, because I think there's two arguments for and against. For, obviously, they had the huge economic growth from just huge, efficient industrialism, and then against
the industrialized execution of Jews.
Yeah.
I think you've raised an important point, and that is that Realpolitik, seeks pragmatic solutions, but then the question becomes pragmatic solutions for whom?
Yeah, what is practical?
Yeah.
I wouldn't say Nazi Germany is a good example of realpolitik. For one, Hitler was he was militarily stupid and economic dumbass as well. So he also was a romanticist as well. If you want to have a more real example of realpolitik, I'd rather take a look at Stalin, USSR actually.
I think.
Well, I don't know. I'd like to. I'm sorry. Continue with your cases for why Nazi Germany was a good example of realpolitik.
I think what Chris is trying to get at is certain. They had some medical findings, right? Is that what you're going to talk about, Chris?
Yeah, that's another example. Just the knowledge from their medical experimentation was huge. Stuff like the oxygen poisoning, where they would just increase oxygen to basically Jews. Or gypsies, and we actually learned a lot about the symptoms that come with increased amounts of oxygen poisoning, and they would just kill them, and that's obviously immoral, but the information gained from it was huge. Not just that, but other experiments as well.
And I think most modern medical doctors would say, I would never do that to a person today, but at this point, since it's been done, shouldn't we take the knowledge and use it? Because it's that ship has sailed. It's already been done. Let's at least take the knowledge and use it for good.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know who brought it up earlier, but about like Stalin and like the USSR and whatnot. But it's actually kind of funny. But the founder of pragmatism I don't know if this was himself, the person I was watching commentating on it. As contrast to the philosophical thought, the philosophical school of pragmatism it would kind of oppose, like the philosophers like Marx, who, Karl Marx, who, thought of philosophies that were very self-interested and very, self-focused, whereas pragmatism focused more on what would benefit us in the here and now, was practical, what was useful knowledge.
So, like a contrast between the short term and the long term, like that is what you're talking about.
Yeah, in a sense. Communism and Marxist principles were really more about protecting the self, protecting the individual, whereas or helping the individual in that sense. Whereas pragmatists thought more in the idea of what would benefit humanity today. Like, for instance, we could fly all the way to Mars, we could, like, the Mars space program and all that stuff, and we'd learn a lot of amazing things, I'm sure. But none of that would really help us in the long run. Like, we're going to discover any new medical cures on Mars, or we might, who knows, but the chances of that are slim. So there's nothing that would really benefit us in the here and now.
Interesting. I wouldn't necessarily make the distinction between long-term and short-term games, because I think if you're really trying to be pragmatic,
you'd go long-term.
Only
right?
looking at only looking at the short term would be incredibly, short-sighted, because the short term ends and eventually, and the long term kicks in at some point. But
That'd probably
back to,
But pragmatic culture, in the long run, we'll all be dead.
But aren't you focused on society with a practical economy and stuff, such like that?
yeah, there's definitely that. But I think to focus on that is, I think pragmatism can also be viewed from the lens of the self versus the lens of society. Like, if you're talking about political pragmatism like Realpolitik, then yeah, it's going to be society as a whole. But there's an element of personal pragmatism where you adopt it as a personal philosophy and kind of, do what's best for you. My concern there would be if it devolved into something like Stirnerite egoism, which is actually retarded. I try not to throw the term around too much, but Stirnerite egoism is retarded.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, but I never heard of Max Stirner.
Oh, save yourself the headache and don't look into him. But I like the example of Nazi Germany as a contrast of whether it was Realpolitik or not. And I kind of wanted to answer that just because you can look at it, and I'd say early on, it kind of was, because what you had was this great cultural uplifting of the German people that enabled them to, gain the will to promote this industrialization, to regain this national spirit after they were horribly demoralized in World War I, and really kind of pull themselves up so that they actually, became a powerful nation again. But at the same time, then once you get later on, and you kind of get into the Holocaust, that would, in my mind, not be a good example of Realpolitik, because if you really wanted to be pragmatic about it, you wouldn't have just exterminated the Jews. You would have just worked them to death in labor camps. So, they're being productive, and at the same time, you're working them so hard, they're just dying off more slowly.
Actually, I heard some arguments that one of the reasons why the Jews were starving to death because it was due to the Allies bombing the supply trains to these concentration camps.
Oh, that's sad.
I mean, I guess that depends on whose account of history you're actually listening to.
That's funny.
That's what I heard, actually. Just I like to mention that time to time.
The point that you brought up earlier, though, about why not just put them in labor camps? I think it was I was just listening to a lecture that Dr. Jordan Peterson was doing.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of too.
Yeah, I thought, in listening to that, I thought it was really interesting. I don't remember what the exact premise of his speech was. I just remember that example, and thinking wow, I never actually thought of that before. He went about because I was actually just about to argue the point that because he saw, the Jewish people as scum and should die so that way the master race can live on. In a sense, you could argue that he was being pragmatic, but I completely forgot about that aspect of it.
Yeah, what Jordan Peterson was kind of arguing was that Hitler was more evil than we thought, because rather than using the Jewish people as like a slave labor force to essentially build his empire for the master race, Hitler saw his master race failing in the fields and was like, fuck it, if these bastards can't even pull themselves up, then I might as well just continue with the extermination, so at least I get something done. And in that way, he abandoned his own people and wanted to continue the extermination of another. And it was like an argument for how Hitler was even more evil than you think, because by his actions, you could derive he was more concerned about just exterminating a people than actually building up his own.
This is why I don't consider Hitler to be a great example of political pragmatism, because he was more so a romantic than anything else. I consider it to be Stalin to be more pragmatic than Hitler, actually.
I'd say there's a case for that, yeah.
I would think so as well, especially when you're talking about how Hitler was so concerned about exterminating the Jews as opposed to the welfare of his own people. One could obviously that's immoral, but in Hitler's mind, it was, at least in his own mind, it was the most moral thing he could do. So for him, it was near the end there, it was his own conception of morality as opposed to pragmatism.
Exactly. Stalin, with the command economy and what, you could argue that he was being very pragmatic, but as opposed to Mao Zedong, who also kind of, from what I understand, he issued a sort of command economy, as most communists do. But Mao Zedong, I remember he was a little bit more romantic with his, I remember actually hearing a story about how all these different communist leaders in China used to have a photo of these kids standing on top of supposedly a wheat crop that was growing so thick that the kids could stand on top of it. But that turned out to be faked, because the reason why was because the communist government at the time was trying to make as much food as possible, when in reality people were starving.
Yeah. Also.
Although I would argue Mao at least was a pragmatist prior to coming to power. He worked with Chiang Kai-shek to expel the Japanese. Well, basically got Kai-shek to do his work for him, and then when Kai-shek's forces were weak, then he expelled them to Taiwan and took control of China. So that was at least a example of pragmatism on Mao's part.
Also, since we're talking about China, can you just give me? I'd like to understand the rationale of Richard Nixon's opening diplomatic relationship to Mao's China. Can anyone explain that to me?
What was the question again?
I'd like to know the rationale of Nixon dealing with Mao, opening a diplomatic relationship with Mao.
I don't know much.
I think it was more of a. I think it was just kind of a general thought in relations between the communist world and the Western world, in that there had been stride made, when Kennedy was president, there was very much or not when Kennedy, when Eisenhower was president, there was very much kind of a thawing of tensions between the two nations up until the U-2 incident. Who is it? I think Nixon, when he was a vice president, went over to visit Khrushchev, and then they had Khrushchev over here. And it was kind of a big cultural exchange. And then the U-2 incident happened, and it kind of all went to shit. But I think it was an idea, because, neither country wanted to go to war. So I think they thought the best option was to just kind of be chill with each other.
I was talking. I was remember an early conversation I had with you, saying you think that opening relationship with China was a mistake. I remember that you said that.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, hindsight's 2020. We wouldn't be 20 trillion in debt if we hadn't been constantly trading with China. But that's another conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also,
what does everybody think of Kissinger?
Yeah.
Not
Oh
a,
boy.
not a history lesson.
Well, he's certainly a colorful character, to put it mildly. Though, before we actually started the live stream, the one thing I was saying about Kissinger is, if they would say Kissinger's biggest pragmatic action, as it were, was the fact that he successfully intertwined himself with the affairs of everyone around him, to the point that even though a lot of the people who he worked for grew to hate him, they couldn't afford to get rid of him because he had so successfully intertwined himself in their affairs. So,
Also, also like to say Nixon as well. He was probably one of the most corrupt presidents that we have in office. But I like to admit that he was probably the most effective president. In his short term as president, he was very effective, very pragmatic in his thinking as well.
A lot of people criticized him because, you can kind of see some parallels between him and Trump in some senses, because, like, he actually kind of came to power out of the conservative movement back then. A lot of people don't really know about the conservative movement because it kind of gets lost in history. I just did like a ton of research on this beforehand, so for a little anyway. But a lot of people don't realize that he came to power because people were tired of the establishment, and they had put him into power to shrink the government. In the end, though, he ended up doing things that were against what he was originally voted to do, much like Trump's kind of trying to do with negotiating with Nancy Pelosi and Schumer, and not getting the wall funding and all that, and giving up DACA, our greatest bargaining chip right now. It's kind of reflective of that, in the sense that some people who voted for him are disappointed. Just like some were disappointed with Nixon at the time.
Interesting.
Do you think
I
it
mean,
was? I'm sorry.
well, I'm still interested in seeing whether or not he's actually given this stuff up, or whether or not the media has greatly exaggerated how he's gone about bargaining, which I imagine they have to just demoralize his base. But we have to wait and see. I suppose we can't really make the judgment right now.
Also, what was Nixon thinking when he implemented a fiat currency? What was he thinking about that? I don't understand his line of thinking when he fully abolished the gold standard.
Well, I imagine that's less to do with realpolitik and more with some economic decision, because it was probably a response to the horrible well, I don't know if it had said in that time, but there was stagflation that was either occurring during his presidency, or like he saw it coming somehow. But I feel like that played a part in it.
Okay, since we're talking about politicians who employ realpolitik during their lives, but I think we should move on to people like Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, because they were in their own way very consequential. Even though I don't think Woodrow Wilson was anyway a pragmatist but idealist. But
Also, we have some. Sorry, we have someone else here. We have Threshin.
Hey,
Oh, hey, what's up?
not much.
And I think we
Well,
also
let's
had
continue.
okay, we just had. I think we had Capitalist Kid float in and out for a second there too.
Capitalist Kid is in the. I'm looking at the live chat. Capitalist Kid joined, but then he said he needs to learn some more history. So, but
Okay.
just Capitalist Kid, you're free to stay in if you want. I'm learning a lot myself. So, but
Fair enough. Fair enough. Respect
I'm with the
the.
big boys.
Oh yeah, it's been very interesting so far.
it's like Woodrow Wilson and the First World War, because I think that was I think politically speaking that the First World War was more so. Some libertarians might see it as a huge political blunder, but people who advocate real politics that saw this as America entering the world stage. That was for us the turning point in our American experiment. Like America was going to be the world leader, the the police of the world. At, I'm thinking way after the fact, but I think that was some mentality of the pragmatists at the time, the idealists at the time.
Yeah, and I agree with that in the sense that it did put us into the world stage, but it also kind of put us into the world's crosshairs. I mean, everybody, it seems like every country on the planet has an opinion on America nowadays, and not exactly all of them good. But I think what also some of the consequences are, did we really need to be the world's police? I mean, I'm just coming, like, just pragmatically speaking, just the amount of resources we've spent on, fixing, situations that, really didn't even get fixed in the end. We just spent a shitload of money and then, killed a bunch of people.
Just
So
people
there are
like
some,
For example, how we spend so much money on foreign aid while these countries, don't really improve by much, or if they improve, it's like pretty much like 0.1%.
exactly.
Well, you can't fix any
Yeah.
problem just by throwing money at it.
Oh yeah.
But hey, that's what the government believes.
They believe it, but the government has proved positive that it doesn't work.
Yeah. And unfortunately, like, I think what's ridiculous is that we give all this foreign aid, we do all this stuff, and at the end of the day, like, they still hate us. We're still in debt. Like, that's what kills me. Like, we're in trillions and trillions of debt, and yet we're giving money to people. Like, I understand we have to borrow money and we have to put ourselves in the red sometimes in order to get through it. But if we're in that far into the red, maybe we should stop giving foreign aid. It's just ridiculous to me. But then again, I'm not well versed on global politics.
And maybe that's due to the government maybe falling too far on certain morals. So you could see a lot of liberals within the government wanting to have these, sorry, I just lost the word, these entitlement plans to stay
Exactly.
for moral.
Oh yeah, definitely. And then there's like
So-
20 trillion is just like the nominal number. That doesn't include we're going to owe in terms of like Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security. When you look at that number, it ends up being something along the lines of like 120 to 150 trillion, because we still need to pay for all these old people down the line. Like, the number keeps getting bigger and bigger. And I think you're right to point out that it's due to like a moralistic sentiment as opposed to a pragmatic one.
So then we kind of get the question of whether government should be held to be more pragmatic or to fulfill the morals of the society in which it's in, or at least their constituents that voted for them, rather.
And while we're on the subject of the debt, I'd like to bring up that it almost seems like at this point a global economic collapse is inevitable. It's just a question of when it happens, and the government always seems to have the mentality of, well, we'll just keep pushing it down the line because we don't want it to happen on our watch. You could argue
expand the credit,
but yeah, that
Well,
only
I mean, that's part of it.
That's part of it, but that just all that does is kick the can down the road, as it were. And that's what they're doing, but still, expanding the credit can't last forever. So
I think
saying that's the pragmatic thing to do, to expand the credit to belong to inevitable. That's the thing. In their eyes, we're too extremist because we believe in free market and voluntary transaction. That's utopian in their eyes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, it's kind of funny. These entitlement programs, like, what I find interesting about it is people say, well, you don't want people to die. You don't want people to suffer. You don't want people to starve. Well, here's the thing. As far as these programs go, they say that that's pragmatic. We're saving lives, so that's pragmatic. Well, in reality, you're only enforcing your morals. You have the moral belief that we should save everyone, that we should spend money on everyone, that we should give everyone the same amount, and everything should be equal. But in reality, you're I don't know what the word is for it. You're causing more harm than good because you're enforcing that moral.
Well, yeah, you're causing population.
And also the people say, like, without welfare, people suffer. Clearly don't know something called private charity.
Yeah, exactly.
Just
We could all
And
agree
even
that
before
giving to
welfare,
charity
there was
is
already
great,
like a
right?
social safety net, built by community, to help people. The government wasn't needed. When
Yeah.
welfare was implemented, it pretty much had no change on poverty, and in some cases raised poverty, whether big or small.
That's the tragedy
Exactly.
of the commons right there.
And I feel
have-
like the biggest issue is more of an ignorance of finance for the masses of the United States, at least, or populations around the world, I guess.
Yes, if you
Well, I
keep
mean,
giving the poor, just money, free money, you don't give them an incentive to leave, since they can just pretty much like exploit the system and just receive free money. Caught in this endless loop of poverty.
Well, I mean, this is kind of the discussion we started off talking about, is that you can take pragmatism and look at it from a couple different angles. One being the angle supposedly that it's pragmatic to just save these people and not have them in extreme poverty, versus the other angle is where no, it's pragmatic to just let these people fall through because you're doing more harm than good to the general society. So it's kind of like, well, whose pragmatic interpretation of the situation is really right?
Just this it's also this is kind of one of the problems with foreign policy, not really seeing the long term effects of it. Like this is why people like Ron Paul or his son Rand kind of get like marginalized, because people like John McCain and others, including Hillary Clinton, view their worldview to be naive at best. They don't understand the chessboard, the game of real politic as well.
Yeah, and I think what like, have you guys heard of? I assume you guys have heard of Dinesh D'Souza, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think this kind of goes back, like when we're like, while we're on the subject of keeping people trapped and why these social programs doesn't work. Dinesh D'Souza's concept of the urban plantation, how we're in a sense enslaving blacks by taking their vote. Because a lot of them vote Democrat out of economic necessity, because a lot of them depend on these social programs, and if these were to go away all of a sudden, they'd be screwed. And so the Democrats have, in a sense, trapped them in an endless cycle of poverty. And it's not right. It's slavery, in a sense. You're taking their vote.
But we're utopian because we want to end welfare and give these people a chance to get out of their property. We're utopian. We don't know anything about the real world.
Yeah, and I mean that's some point that a lot of I guess libertarians to bring up is the social programs are almost, in essence, I think Stefan Molyneux might have said it. I think it was buying their vote essentially, but just through indirect means, I guess.
Yep.
But we're utopian. We don't know what we're talking about. We need to take care of the old people. We want to see old people to die on the street. We also don't care about poor people either, because we also don't also want to see them die on the street as well.
I think one good question might be whether going to seeing the world through a more pragmatic or realpolitik lens, would that just kind of eventually contort itself to another form of morality, because everybody would have a different perspective of what actually would be practical.
Yes.
Yes,
I wish I brought a real
government
pragmatic guy in here.
Those are the arguments I see for
Oi.
government benefits is based on morality rather than effectiveness. And even when they, use morality, privatize, like things like private, charities are more moral than government benefits.
Just
And I almost wonder, I'm not sure it's possible to be solely a pragmatist without any kind of moral constraints. I mean, by definition, a person without any moral constraints they would call that a sociopath. But even then, it seems to me that moral constraints of some sort end up arising, because adjudicating between what is and is not practical involves some form of moral calculation.
Well, that's inevitably the pitfall that comes with pragmatism, is that you can always argue that it's good to be moral, it's good to be realistic, it's good to be to always lead your life based off of logic. However, oftentimes we forget that logic is a vehicle for moral. So if you believe morally that overpopulation is eventually going to cause suffering and starvation, well then logically you would think that the answer would be, hey, let's just nuke a couple of countries, or let's just let a few people starve to death in order to improve the quality of life of everyone.
Actually, that's not the. Actually, I watched a guy's video about that. His solution is that we just need to incentivize people to have less kids, and also show sex education as well, and also need to for these
Well,
also
I think you
Yeah.
could break it down to the Margaret Sanger version or the like soft Margaret Sanger version. Because Margaret Sanger, she was like she was for forced abortions, forced sterilization. She called the poor human weeds, that kind of thing. There are others that would say, no, you shouldn't force abortions, you shouldn't force sterilization, you should just encourage people to have less kids. I feel like
Yeah.
in principle they're kind of on the same track. It's just how far they're willing to go with it.
Oh yeah.
because
And
if you want to know more about the overpopulation, I recommend Nero's of Rome video about it because he does make some interesting arguments for it.
I'll have to look that
I
up.
I don't
Heroes
necessarily
of Rome.
consider overpopulation a major problem,
I
but
don't.
I guess that's
I honestly don't either. I feel like the populate. It just kind of summarize my view. The population is growing, but the growth rate is still slowing. So it would inevitably, in my opinion, top out at some
Also,
point.
But
also
that's just
people
one
who have
example,
more,
though, of how logic can, in a sense, be fueled by morals and lead to something immoral. So, take for instance, like what would be a good example? Who could make a logical case for rape? I know it's an extreme example and it's messed up, and I don't advocate this. But you could make a logical case for rape. You could say, well, it costs too many resources to stop it or prevent it, and it also, it propagates the species technically.
The
It creates
strict
babies.
Darwinian argument: reproduce with as many
Something.
women as possible to ensure that your genes are passed on to the next generation.
Exactly.
hey,
Wait,
more
So
let me just say something. Pretty much, if you word anything right, you can make anything sound logical. Like, for example, you can make
Oh, yeah.
Nazism sound not that bad, or communism. Just if you word it right,
Oh yeah,
you can
you're right.
sound
that's
right.
soft.
exactly,
To be
that's a
honest,
good
that
point.
is really sophistry.
Well, especially if you're going to assume some sort of outcome. So you could say, well, the Nazis are fine because, eventually aliens would have come down and the gas chambers are perfect to deal with the aliens. So it was fine.
Yeah.
yeah. There's also I think the other part of being the pragmatist though is like assuming realistic expectations though. Like I don't think like you
Exactly.
probably couldn't make that case as a pragmatist only
Oh,
because
hell no.
aliens is kind of an unrealistic solution to the problem of the Holocaust. But at the same time, you could make the case saying that, well, we're currently living in a society in which the dominant philosophical outlook is something of a neo-Marxist type. And that's leading to more chaos and more destruction within society than if we say had the cultural stability in which the Nazis, if the Nazis had one instead, and they kind of ensued one dominant kind of Protestant work ethic kind of culture. So in that sense, it might have been better if, say, the Nazis had won World War II than if the Allies and the Soviet Union had won. Like that's kind of a case I feel like you could get away with making and still claim to be a pragmatist.
Yeah. There,
Here's a question for everyone. How pragmatic do you think you really are?
Pragmatic enough, I guess.
So usually not usually. Sometimes the practical outcome will conflict against our morals, right? So you can bring up a ton of examples. Like if you're moral, I'll bring up the classic train situation, which I brought up many times before. So the classic moral is that killing is wrong, which I think a lot of people agree with, right?
Mhm.
But then in this classic hypothetical situation where there's a train and the brakes are broken and there's 5 people stuck on the track and they can't get out, and you're standing next to the track, and for some reason there's a gigantic fat guy next to the track, you can push him over, which will stop the train and save the 5 people. But then you'll be killing someone. So are you willing to do that though?
And I know what case you're talking about. And what was interesting about that is that there were two scenarios. Because first it was there are 4 people on the track, and then there's one person on the track
Yeah.
to the side. And if you pull the lever, it'll derail the train. It'll only kill one person as opposed to 4. And when surveyed, almost everyone said, yes, I would pull the lever and cause the train to kill the one person because it's better. Somebody's going to die better for only one person to die than the 4 people to
Yes, to
die.
cause less harm
But
overall.
But then they change the scenario and they say, wait, instead of changing the track, you actually push the fat guy and it saves us the other 4. And all the people who voted that they'd switch the track, almost all of them said, well, no, I wouldn't do that. I'm willing to it was the whole thing about the doctrine of double effect. I'm willing to pull the lever, and then the unintended consequence is 1 person died, but 4 people saved. 4 people are saved. In the case of the other, I am actively killing a person, even though the desired consequence is to save the other 4.
Right. So, I mean, what is the moral here? Is it that killing is wrong? Because that's what people are fighting against, right? They have to decide,
Yes.
well, what am I going to do? Save more people or kill someone? So at what point do you break your own morals to get the best outcome?
Well, I think if we're just going with that same scenario, the point where people weren't willing to cross is they were willing to say, I'm willing to take an action that the action in itself is morally neutral, even though the result might be bad, but they're not willing to actually commit any moral act just because it might lead to a moral outcome.
And I guess it also depends on your interpretation of the situation as well. Because I could argue that pulling the lever is the same as pushing the guy, because the intention, I guess.
How close do you personally follow your morals? Like,
I feel like the case could be made as well that when you have a certain set of morals that you believe lead to the best outcome, like whether or not pragmatism is actually the base for your moral system or not, if you just think that your moral system happens to lead to the best outcomes, you could make the case that pragmatism and your moral system
work together.
Are just inherently inseparable, not because pragmatism was your base, just because of the way it happens to work out. So you can kind of justify the pragmatism through that as well.
I love hypothetical situations. I have another one if you want to hear it.
Yeah, I'm liking them, sure.
So this one's about free speech. This incident actually happened recently at the high school we went to. So there's a kid that wore this Confederate sweatshirt, and obviously that's a form of free speech, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'd say so.
Okay, I just make sure you all agree so we're on the same page. And he was getting death threats, so they actually sent him home. I mean, do they have the right to do that?
They sent him home on the grounds that he was receiving death threats, and they wanted to save his life.
Yeah, so you're saying the administration from the high school decided that he should be sent home because of a threat to safety. I mean, I guess you would just say if he consented to leaving.
Well, okay, let's change the situation where they forced him to go home, but he wanted to stay at school.
It depends. How old was he?
Let's say he was 17.
A minor.
Okay, so he's a minor?
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay, then in that case, legally speaking, you'd have to kind of, because, of course, you have to be 18 to be able to decide yourself in the eyes of the law for you to decide your own, things based off of safety. So I would say that it'd be up to the parents at that point. But it would be
I probably screwed up the description. Maybe I should try again, or maybe you guys should go on to another topic.
Well, do we want to talk about Wilson and Realpolitik and kind of the thought a little bit more, and kind of get behind the thought of intervention in World War I at all?
Yeah, let's go behind that.
Because I kind of think I'm not sure there was much of a consideration for Realpolitik if I'm thinking about it at first, except in a very, very short-term sense, because the only reason Wilson got involved in the war, at first he was totally against it, and to me that kind of underlines the real kind of his real thoughts on the situation anyway, because it wouldn't have been good for him to have entered a war and then have all these people die on his watch and that kind of thing. But at the same time, the only reason he entered the war was to in the response to the sinking of that cruise liner. I forget the name. Was it the Lusitania?
I heard that was a false flag.
I don't know about that. You could only have I'm with today, it's easier to get false flags, but I imagine back then it would have been a little bit tougher. But I think it was kind of just to save face, though. Like, I don't think Realpolitik was much of an consider, except in like the very, very short term for like, you know, Wilson, because if he didn't go to war, he'd kind of look like a pussy, and like the public outcry would be massive, kind of like why Bush had to essentially go into the Middle East after 9/11. Otherwise, it would have been horrible, and the outcry against him would have looked, you know, would have been massive.
But just saying. Well, like I said, Woodrow Wilson was more so an idealist. It was his idea to create the League of Nations. That was didn't help, but that was idealism right there.
Oh yeah, he was obsessed with that.
Just you get like libertarian thinkers like Peter Schiff saying entering the First World War was a mistake because some he I'm not sure about I'm not sure what he actually says because he thinks it led to the 1921 depression under Harding. Just no. Also war just do you hear me?
Yeah.
No, I hear you. I hear you.
Just like I said, it did put America on the world stage for the very I think like was the first time. Just getting involved in European affairs and just whether whether that was a mistake or not, but the the consequence is that America was put on the spot and was on the world stage and started the first attempt of a so-called internationalist organization called the League of Nations.
Do we think there's any, situations in which Realpolitik is being applied now in which morals would maybe do a better job or would lead to maybe a better outcome in at least our eyes?
And intervening with North Korea.
Are you saying Realpolitik would be better to deal with North Korea, or morals would be?
Realpolitik.
It really depends. Because if you're talking like if North Korea continues to threaten us, continues to threaten our territories, and continues to be a threat, then definitely we can do something to deal with the problem. But if it's simply on ideological principles, then no, I don't think that would be very wise.
I'm almost inclined to say not intervening with North Korea is an example of Realpolitik. Because think about the situation. I mean, I don't think the U.S. has ever wanted North Korea to exist since the Korean War. The issue was that the Chinese said, if you attack North Korea, we will come to if you attack North Korea, we will come to their aid. If they attack you, we won't. But if you attack them, we'll come to their aid. I mean, I think both Kim Jong-il and now Kim Jong-un I don't think they really have any intention of actually attacking the United States. They know that's a war they ultimately couldn't win, but the part of their power base is derived from the fact that the people believe they're gods, or that Kim Jong-un is a god. And in order to maintain that image, he needs to look big and tough. So he puts on all these shows, although I don't think he really has any intention of attacking the United States.
I like pragmatically speaking, I just think that'd be a good justification to intervene with North Korea, given that they did have a oppressive dictator for about a few generations now, and I think it's justifiable. Just the fact that they keep threatening Japan and South Korea. I think intervening is a good idea. Like actually, me personally, because I'm going off the tangent now. I think we're getting off topic.
Okay. Well, I personally am going to have to get going in just a little bit here. So I don't know what everybody else has planned for the night, but if you have any closing thoughts, maybe now's the time to do them.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Me personally, I think that it's very important as a society to think logically, to think pragmatically when it comes to political situations, but at the same time, we cannot lose sight of our morals. And we can't always think logically on situations because there are certain because the end doesn't always justify the means, because you still have to live with the means.
Yes, I would say Machiavelli was wrong on that point when he said the end justified the means. And truth be told, I think if you could have known Machiavelli personally and seen how he lived, he might have written that. But I seriously doubt he actually applied it consistently in his own life.
Oh yeah.
Well, after I took a philosophy class just a semester ago, and one of the things that was brought up was that Machiavelli actually believed nothing he wrote in the Prince. That was more of a, like, he thought that was an effective way, I think, to run government, but it was almost more of an application for. He kept getting kicked out of his city. I think it was Venice. Venice? Yeah, I want to say it was Venice. Florence, yeah, Florence or Venice. And so to get in good with the family that was ruling there, I don't think it was the De Medicis. I think it was the Borgias. The Borgias. I think it was the Borgias. In order to get in good with them, he wrote them a political outline, essentially how to run an efficient tyranny, I guess is what it would be called. But I think it can be applied more broadly to just how to run an effective government anyway, because government's either going to be tyranny or it's not going to exist at all.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe the major issue, I guess within this whole discussion is where realpolitik or pragmaticism, should be applied. And I think we're seeing that, mostly that would be through government means, but with the foundation of the morals within the society, that is agreed upon in something like a social contract. So I guess in something a more libertarian state, you would have, the NAP to obviously be a foundation, but overall, maybe that small night watch government would be more pragmatic than, pragmatism would, take the front seat where the NAP would take the back seat. What do you guys think about that?
I think the general concept is right. I mean, I don't agree too much with the NAP in particular, just because I'm not sure how useful it is for analyzing actual cases in which you were to prosecute certain criminals. And so I think because of the trouble it kind of has, I'm not sure how useful as an underlying principle it could be. But I do agree that sometimes, if you're looking for objectively the best results, I mean, sometimes you might not consider them what's in the best moral interest. So, but if they are the best, then they are the best, and you kind of have to give way, I guess.
I mean, like an example of that would be government torturing prisoners to get information.
Yeah, definitely. Excuse me.
Yeah, I think that in general it's important to think in terms of, I just lost my train of thought. I don't know what happened. I had an idea and then I had an idea and it slipped from my grasp.
That's I think realpolitik was applied to a lot of our foreign policy naturally. I think the arguments like you hear from I think we just became actually moralist than pragmatic actually in what's going on in the world.
Definitely.
And I think if I had to sum up my views on realpolitik, I think everyone has to apply some level of pragmatism. The question is but ultimately morals are going to adjudicate at some point. The question is, at what point will that be? And that's the discussion that will never end.
Yeah, and that's probably just whether you think emotions or rationality, have a stronger control over the individual or not. Because I'd see morals as a little bit more of, they're a mix between rationality and emotion, but pragmatism would be almost entirely rationale.
Yeah. I don't think I think libertarianism is more so about just being consistent with your principles if anything else. But I think the way these libertarian YouTubers seem to present it as more as a almost utopian idealist, very idealist view of things.
Right. It's important to understand that libertarian philosophy has its flaws. It definitely has flaws. It is no way a utopia. People are going to take advantage of it, but the important part is,
I just mean like how it's presented by these current YouTubers as of right now.
yeah. No, the truth is there's really no perfect solution to
Yeah,
any problem.
Just only trade-offs, just which is the best trade-off, which is kind of subjective at times.
Yeah. And sometimes, part of that trade-off means people will, they'll get the end of the stick, in a sense. Just take, for instance, the free market. Does the free market allow for poverty? Yes, it does. But it also allows for the freedom to move up out of poverty.
Yeah, that's a.
And I think
Yeah,
that's what a lot of people lose sight of.
That's the thing. That's the thing of it. People just need to accept the reality of like the only reason why libertarians see free markets as more so as a better solution than if anything else, because they realize if we allow the government true, it will cause more problems in the long run of things.
Yeah, I know my 2 cents.
Right.
A little summation of his point. Does anybody else want to give a little, summation of what their final thoughts are on Realpolitik in the end?
Me personally, I think it's the other form of collectivism. It's just basically like a chessboard game among what's going on in the world. It's just allowing politicians to pursue what's their self interest, not their nation. That's what's going on in their head, not the interests of the people. I think it's the other form of tribalism.
I don't know if I'd go that far. What I would say about it, though, is that I think when you're going for what's pragmatic, at least in my case, I can honestly say when I look for pragmatism, it's because I believe what can pragmatically be achieved is still morally right. Like the example I kind of gave earlier was exactly what I think. Like I think and this might be delusional, I don't know, but I think what I want from society, at least, is what would honestly be best for it. And if there are pragmatic steps to achieving that, then I don't mind if they don't exactly live up to my one and single every principle at this moment, so long as in the long term, what I want can be achieved. And so I think if you look at it like that, and you don't look at it as like, oh, just like I'm trying to individually be selfish, if you look at it kind of in a broader sense in the long term for everyone, maybe it is a little bit collectivistic, but if at the end of the day, part of that is, achieving a free market, which is something I genuinely think helps everyone and stuff like that, you're actually going to be able to help more people in the long run. So the short-term betrayal of your principles for a long-term payoff is, I think, I would argue that that's a big part of pragmatism, and that something like that can be morally justified.
Gotcha.
Right.
So I end the stream here.
All right.
Sure.
Thanks everybody
All right.
for
Sounds
watching.
good.
Cool.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Go ahead and put the links to all our channels in the description, and everybody subscribe.
Yeah,
Peace.
thanks so much, guys.
Well,
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
I appreciate it, man.
this was an interesting conversation. I hope you all enjoyed, and please subscribe to these channels. And I probably will forget putting them in the description, but please find them.
All right.